Number 633 will be our next song. If you would like to put the ribbon of the book marker. About a week or so ago, I was in El Paso, Texas, and Brother Fred Lovins shared with me something that was meaningful to me, and I plan to share it with you today. You know, ladies and gentlemen, the New Testament church did not single out one Sunday to celebrate the resurrection of our Lord. The real truth of it is, in the church in the Bible, every Sunday was Easter. Every Sunday, they observed the Lord's Supper, celebrating the death, burial, and resurrection of our Lord. No one told anybody who could partake of it and who couldn't. The Scriptures say, let a man examine himself, and so let him partake. I told them this morning at Madison, every Sunday is Easter, and every day is Christmas. And I think that's beautiful, and I think that's wonderful. I'm going to do something today I have never done in my ministry, some 37 years. You know, our college students nowadays, boys and girls getting to college, cannot write. They cannot, some of them, write a correct, clear English sentence. And the reason these college students cannot write is because they cannot read. We are a nation that fastly is forgetting how to read, I'm afraid. I think television is to blame for a lot of this. I'm not fighting television. I thank God that we are able to use it and are adding these major cities one by one. But I think it's tragic that our young people are deprived of using their own imagination, because television uses it for you. But when you read, you have to use your own mind. The boys and girls who learn to read are fortunate indeed. I read a poem once. The essence says, when I was young, we were very poor, and yet I was very, very rich because I had a daddy that read to me. So in a nation that has forgotten how to read and doesn't love to read and doesn't appreciate reading, that's exactly what I'm going to do for our lesson today. I'm going to share with you a testimony about the crucifixion of Jesus by an outstanding American doctor. Dr. C. Truman Davis, nationally known and highly respected, is the Vice President of the American Association of Ophthalmology. And I think his article on viewing the crucifixion from the standpoint of a Christian doctor is excellent. And I hope you will listen carefully. It takes 20 minutes to read it. And following this, we'll be singing together one of the greatest songs ever written on the cross, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. About a decade ago, I realized that I had for years taken the crucifixion more or less for granted, that I had grown callous to its horrors by a too easy familiarity with the grim details and a too distant friendship with our Lord. It finally occurred to me that though a physician, I didn't even know the actual immediate cause of death. The gospel writers don't help us very much on this point, because crucifixion and scourging were so common during their lifetime that they apparently considered a detailed description unnecessary. So we have only the concise words of the evangelist. Pilate, having scourged Jesus, delivered him to them to be crucified, and they crucified him. I have no competence to discuss the infinite psychic and spiritual suffering of the incarnate God atoning for the sins of fallen man. But it seemed to me that as a physician, I might pursue the physiological aspects of our Lord's passion in some detail. What did the body of Jesus of Nazareth actually endure during those horrible hours of torture. This led me to a study of the practice of crucifixion itself. That is, torture and execution by fixation to a cross. I am indebted to many who have studied this subject in the past, and especially to a contemporary colleague, Dr. Pierre Barbet, a French surgeon who has done exhaustive historical and experimental research and has written extensively on the subject. Apparently, the first known practice of crucifixion was by the Persians. Alexander and his generals brought it back to the Mediterranean world, to Egypt and to Carthage. The Romans apparently learned the practice from the Carthaginians, and as with almost everything the Romans did, rapidly developed a very high degree of efficiency and skill at it. A number of Roman authors commented on the crucifixion, and several innovations, modifications, and variations are described in ancient literature. For instance, the upright portion of the cross could have the cross arms attached 2 or 3 feet below its top in what we commonly think of as the Latin cross. The most common form used in our Lord's day, however, was the tall cross, shaped like a Greek letter, like our T. In this cross, the crossbar was placed in a notch at the top of the pole. There is archaeological evidence that it was on this type of cross that Jesus was crucified. Without any historical or biblical proof, medieval and Renaissance painters have given us our picture of Christ carrying the entire cross. But the upright post was generally fixed permanently in the ground at the site of the execution, and the condemned man was forced to carry the crossbar weighing about 110 pounds from the prison to the place of execution. Many of these painters and most of the sculptures of crucifixes also show the nails through the palms. Historical Roman accounts and experimental work have established that the nails were driven between the small bones of the wrist and not through the palms. Nails driven through the palms will strip out between the fingers when made to support the weight of the human body. The misconception may have come about through an misunderstanding of Jesus' words to Thomas, "Observe my hands." Anatomists, both modern and ancient, have always considered the wrist as a part of the hand. A small sign stating the victim's crime was usually placed on a staff, carried at the front of the procession from the prison, and later nailed to the cross so that it extended above the head. This sign, with its staff nailed to the top of the cross, would have given it somewhat the characteristic form of the Latin cross. But of course, the physical passion of Christ began in Gethsemane. Of the many aspects of this initial suffering, the one of the greatest physiological interest is the blood sweat. It is interesting that Luke, the physician, is the only one to mention this. He says, "And being in agony, he prayed the longer, and his sweat became as drops of blood trickling down upon the ground." Every ruse imaginable has been used by modern scholars to explain away this description, apparently under the mistaken impression that this just doesn't happen. A great deal of effort could have been saved had the doubters consulted medical literature. Though very rare, the phenomenon of bloody sweat is well documented. Under great emotional stress of the kind our Lord suffered, tiny capillaries in the sweat glands can break, thus mixing blood with sweat. This process might well have produced marked weakness and possible shock. After the arrest in the middle of the night, Jesus was next brought before the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas, the high priest. It is here that the first physical trauma was inflicted. A soldier struck Jesus across the face for remaining silent when questioned by Caiaphas. The palace guards then blindfolded him, and mockingly taunted him to identify them as each of them passed by, spat on him, and struck him in the face. In the early morning, battered and bruised, dehydrated and exhausted from a sleepless night, Jesus is taken across Jerusalem to the praetorium of Fortress Antonia, the seat of the government of the procurator of Judea, Pontius Pilate. You are, of course, familiar with Pilate's action in attempting to pass responsibility to Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Judea. Jesus apparently suffered no physical mistreatment at the hands of Herod and was returned to Pilate. It was then in response to the cries of the mob that Pilate ordered Barabbas released and condemned Jesus to scourging and crucifixion. There is much disagreement among authorities about the unusual scourging as prelude to crucifixion. Most Roman writers from this period do not associate the two. Many scholars believe that Pilate originally ordered Jesus scourged as his full punishment, and that the death sentence by crucifixion came only in response to the taunt by the mob that the procurator was not properly defending Caesar against the pretender who allegedly claimed to be king of the Jews. Preparations for the scourging were carried out when the prisoner was stripped of his clothing and his hands tied to a post above his head. It is doubtful the Romans would have made any attempt to follow the Jewish law in this matter, but the Jews had an ancient law prohibiting more than 40 lashes. The Roman legionnaire steps forward with a flagellum in his hand. This is a short whip consisting of several heavy leather thongs with 2 small balls of lead attached near the end of each. The heavy whip is brought down with full force again and again across Jesus' shoulder, back, and legs. At first, the thongs cut through the skin only. Then, as the blows continue, they cut deeper into the tissues, producing first an oozing of blood from the capillaries and veins of the skin, and finally spurting arterial bleeding from vessels in the underlying muscles. The small balls of lead first produce large, deep bruises, which are broken open by subsequent blows. Finally, the skin of the back is hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area is in an unrecognizable mass of torn, bleeding tissue. When it is determined by the centurion in charge that the prisoner is near death, the beating is finally stopped. The half-fainting of Jesus is then untied. The half-fainting Jesus is then untied and allowed to slump to the stone pavement, wet with his own blood. The Roman soldiers see a great joke in this provincial Jew claiming to be the king. They throw a robe across his shoulders and place a stick in his hand for a sepulchre. They still need a crown to make their travesty complete. Flexible branches covered with long thorns, commonly used in bundles for firewood, are plaited into the shape of a crown, and this is pressed into his scalp. Again, there is copious bleeding, the scalp being one of the most vascular areas of the body. After mocking him and striking him across the face, the soldiers take the stick from his hand and strike him across the head, driving the thorns deeper to his scalp. Finally, they tire of their sadistic sport, and the robe is torn from his back. Already having adhered to the clots of blood and serum in the wounds, its removal causes excruciating pain, just as in the careless removal of a surgical bandage. And almost as though he were again being whipped, the wounds once more began to bleed. In deference to Jewish customs, the Romans returned his garments. The heavy crosspiece of the cross is tied across his shoulders, and the procession of the condemned Christ, 2 thieves, and the execution detail of Roman soldiers, headed by a centurion, begins its slow journey along the Via Dolorosa. In spite of his efforts to walk erect, the weight of the heavy wooden beam, together with the shock produced by copious blood loss, is too much. He stumbles and falls. The rough wood of the beam gouges into the lacerated skin and muscles of the shoulders. He tries to rise, but human muscles have been pushed beyond their endurance. The centurion, anxious to get on with the crucifixion, selects a stalwart North African onlooker, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross. Jesus followed, still bleeding and sweating the cold, clammy sweat of shock, until the 650-yard journey from the Fortress Antonia to Golgotha is finally completed. The prisoner is again stripped of his clothes, except for a loincloth, which is allowed by the Jews, and the crucifixion begins. Jesus is offered wine mixed with myrrh, a mild analgesic mixture. He refuses to drink. Simon is ordered to place the crossbar on the ground, and Jesus is quickly thrown backward with his shoulders against the wood. The legionnaire feels for the depression at the front of the wrist. He drives a heavy square wrought iron nail through the wrist and deep into the wood. Quickly, he moves to the other side and repeats the action, being careful not to pull the arms too tightly, but to allow some flexion and movement. The crosspiece is then lifted in place at the top of the pole, and the sign reading Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, is nailed in place. The left foot is now pressed backward against the right foot, and with both feet extended, toes down, a nail is driven through the arch of each, leaving the knees moderately flexed. The victim is now crucified. As he slowly sags down with more weight on the nails in the wrist, excruciating pain shoots along the fingers and up the arms to explode in the brain. The nails in the wrist are putting pressure on the median nerves. As he pushes himself upward to avoid this stretching torment, he places his full weight on the nails through his feet. Again, there is searing agony of the nail tearing through the nerves between the metatarsal bones of the feet. At this point, as the arms fatigue, great waves of cramp sweep over the muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps comes the inability to push himself upward. Hanging by his arms, the pectoral muscles are paralyzed, and the intercostal muscles are unable to act. Air can be drawn into the lungs, but cannot be exhaled. Jesus fights to raise himself in order to get even one short breath. Finally, carbon dioxide builds up in the lungs and in the bloodstream, and the cramps partially subside. Spasmodically, he is able to push himself upward to exhale and bring in the life-giving oxygen. It was undoubtedly during these periods that he uttered the 7 short sentences which are recorded. The first, looking down at the Roman soldiers throwing dice for his seamless garment. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The second, to the penitent thief, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. The third, looking down at the terrified, grief-stricken adolescent John, the beloved apostle, he said, behold thy mother. Then looking to his mother Mary, woman, behold thy son. The fourth cry is from the beginning of the 22nd Psalm. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Hours of this limitless pain, cycles of twisting, joint-rending cramps, intermittent partial asphyxiation, searing pain, where tissues is torn from his lacerated back as he moves up and down against the rough timber. Then another agony begins, a terrible crushing deep in the chest as the pericardium slowly fills with cerium and begins to compress the heart. One remembers again the 22nd Psalm, verse 14. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. It is now almost over. The loss of tissue floods has reached a critical level. The compressed heart is struggling to pump heavy, thick, sluggish blood into the tissues. The tortured lungs are making a frantic effort to gasp in small gulps of air. The markedly dehydrated tissues send their flood of stimuli to the brain. Jesus gasped his fifth cry, I thirst. One remembers another verse from the prophetic 22nd Psalm, my strength is dried up, my tongue cleaveth to my jaws. and thou hast brought me into the dust of death. A sponge soaked in the cheap sour wine, which is the staple drink of the Roman legionaries, is lifted to his lips. He apparently doesn't take any of the liquid. The body of Jesus is now in extremity, and he can feel the chill of death creeping through his tissues. This realization brings out his 6 words, possibly little more than a tortured whisper. It is finished. His mission of atonement has been completed. Finally, he can allow his body to die. With one last surge of strength, he once again presses his torn feet against the nail, straightens his legs, takes a deeper breath, and utters his 7th and last cry, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. The rest you know. In order that the Sabbath not be profaned, the Jews asked the condemned men be dispatched and removed from the crosses. The common method of ending a crucifixion was by crucifacture, the breaking of bones of the legs. This prevented the victim from pushing himself upward. Thus, the tension could not be relieved from the muscles of the chest, and rapid suffocation occurred. The legs of the 2 thieves were broken. But when the soldiers came to Jesus, they saw that this was unnecessary. Apparently, to make doubly sure of the death, the legionnaire drove his lance through the 5th inner space between the ribs, upward through the pericardium and into the heart. The 34th verse of the 19th chapter of the Gospel according to John reports, and immediately there came out blood and water. That is, there was an escape of watery fluid from the sac surrounding the heart, and blood from the interior of the heart, giving us post-mortem evidence that our Lord died not the usual crucifixion, death by suffocation, but of a heart failure due to a shock and constriction of the heart by fluid in the pericardium. Thus, we have had our glimpse, including the medical evidence, of that epitome of evil which man has exhibited toward man and toward God. It has been a terrible sight, and more than enough to leave us despondent and depressed. However, grateful we can be that we have the great sequel in the infinite mercy of God toward man. At once the miracle of the atonement and the expectation of the triumphant resurrection morning. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count as lost and pour contempt on all my